Happy Monday morning, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Some Stops Along the Way. Let me get my microphone sorted out here just a little bit. There we go. Rocking my Oklahoma shirt, feeling my roots a little bit this morning. For all my Okie friends that are watching this podcast, welcome to you. If you haven't been to the state of Oklahoma, I'd recommend a trip. It's a very, very cool place with a lot of great people. So today we're going to start a new section of this podcast. It's going to be an episode about my time in Cyprus. Actually, it'll be a couple of episodes about Cyprus. But in my book, Some Stops Along the Way, this discussion of Cyprus actually starts a new section of the book called Hope and Hopelessness. And the reason that it's called Hope and Hopelessness is because this was a period in my career when there was an extraordinary amount of success. But also, it was the time in my career when I really stood on the precipice of whether or not I was going to be able to continue to do the work that I love to do. I came to a point of exhaustion. I came to a point of demoralization, came to a point of personal angst that I didn't know if I was going to be able to move forward or not. That came later. It didn't come in Cyprus. It came later on. And we'll get to that eventually on this podcast, but I want to start this new section, Hope and Hopelessness, with a discussion of the step that I took in my career after Afghanistan. I left Kabul, Afghanistan for the final time on July 27th, 2007. I remember that day very vividly because the day that I flew into Kabul in 2003, there had been a rocket attack at the airport. The day that I flew out on July 27, 2007, just as our plane was taxiing to the runway, there was a whirring sound and a missile impacted the hill on the other side of the airport. They shut the airport down for close to 2 hours. And so my last day in Kabul was very much similar to my first day in that I was delayed at the airport. My friend Hedvig flew out with me that day. I left without very much fanfare. I didn't want to party. I didn't want anybody trumpeting my achievements. I just wanted to go. I was done at that point in time. You know, I'm a big believer that no matter how good a leader you may be, there comes a time when you have to be realistic with yourself and know that somebody else should step in and pick up where you left off. And that's where I was in July of 2007. I felt like I'd done what I could do in Afghanistan. I felt like that I had tempted fate. I had, in some cases, not done the most prudent thing as far as my own security. I was too comfortable. But at the same time, I loved the work. And so I just kept holding on and on for a long period of time until I finally heeded my wife's advice when she asked me to go. And I did that. And sitting on that plane that day, waiting for the airport to reopen, I thought about the last almost 4 years, 3 years, 10 months, and 9 days at that point in time. And everything that had happened everything that we had accomplished, some of the things we hadn't accomplished, the people I was leaving behind to do the work, and quite frankly, some people that I really cared about that didn't make it back. All those thoughts were going through my head, and I began to become a little bit morose, and even Hedvig's cheery disposition couldn't really bring me out of my funk. And so we finally took off. We got to Dubai, where I had a layover on my way back to the States for a few days of R&R before Debbie and I would deploy to Nicosia, Cyprus. I walked into that hotel room and didn't even turn on the lights. Put the card in, the lights started to come on, I turned them off. I took off the boots that I wore in Afghanistan virtually every day, scuffed at the toes, worn, a lot of memories in those boots. I still have them in the closet today. I took those boots off and I hurled them against the wall. I got undressed and I went and took a shower, and I just stood in the shower and finally sat down in the shower. I don't know how long I was in there, but it was a long time. I felt part relief, part joy, part sadness, part anger. All these emotions were welling up within me as I was closing a chapter of my life that up until that time had been one of the most difficult chapters that I could have imagined, and yet one of the most rewarding as well. But I got myself together and had a nice meal, got some rest, flew back to the States for a few days, and then Debbie and I deployed together to Nicosia, Cyprus, to begin a profoundly interesting engagement there, funded by the U.S. government. Our job was to work with the Turkish Cypriots to help them build a closer relationship with the Greek Cypriots, but also to lay the foundation for eventual reunification of the island of Cyprus, and hopefully the integration of the northern part of the island into the European Union, as the southern part of the island, the Greek part of the island called the Republic of Cyprus, had already achieved. It was an economic growth project, but it had a number of different components in it, including a policy component, a tourism component, an agriculture component. It was really something that was fascinating, and I was looking forward to it. Now, many of you that haven't been to Cyprus may not know that Cyprus, even though Cyprus is an island, it's very dry. Flying in, I remember looking down and just seeing tan and brown. It is a very historic place, and we'll talk about the history of Cyprus on this on an episode in the future. But its recent history has been one of a lot of turmoil and a lot of angst, as the island was divided, and the Greek and Turkish Cypriots, who had lived together in peace for many years, developed a fractured relationship that eventually led to a separation of the island leaving it the only divided country left in Europe at that time. And Nicosia is the only divided capital in Europe. The interesting thing about our work in Cyprus is that we didn't have in many other locations. Number one, we had embassy credentials in Cyprus. So I actually had a diplomatic badge. They're a yellow badge, which was kind of that was a hanger-on badge. That wasn't the real badge that the cool kids had. That was the badge that would get you into the embassy through security without any problem and give you quote-unquote diplomatic credentials out in the community. But those that worked in the embassy, that were real Foreign Service officers, they saw the yellow badge and, oh, okay, you're a hanger-on. But that was okay. The interesting thing, though, was that we worked in the north. My office was in the north part of Nicosia, the capital city. But we were required by the Greek Cypriots to live in the southern part of Nicosia, the capital. And so our house was in the Republic of Cyprus, which was in the European Union. Our office was in the northern part of Cyprus, which was not. Another interesting thing is that the southern part of the island, inhabited mostly by Greek Cypriots, is referred to around the world as the Republic of Cyprus. It's a member of the EU. But we were not allowed, working there, to call it the Republic of Cyprus. Nor were we allowed to call the northern part of the island, which is referred to by the Turkish Cypriots and the government of Turkey, Turkey, as it is now, as the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. We were not allowed to call it that. We had to refer to the Turkish Cypriot community and the Greek Cypriot community. So when we were talking about the Republic of Cyprus, we would use the term Greek Cypriot community. When we were talking about the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, we would talk about the Turkish Cypriot community. We actually had a vocabulary there, words that you could use and not use. There was a very funny incident about the name of cheese that is kind of indicative of Cyprus as a whole and the dichotomy of this island in the Mediterranean. I hadn't been there very long when some of the associations on the Turkish Cypriot side that worked with the agriculture sector were informed that they could no longer sell their cheese under the name halloumi, because halloumi was the cheese that was sold by the Greeks and the Greek Cypriot community. And of course, our Turkish Cypriot friends were very upset about that, and so a meeting was convened, including EU representatives and representatives from the associations on the Turkish Cypriot side, associations on the Greek Cypriot side. I begged the Turkish Cypriots to prepare for this meeting, to bring legal representation. But no, they decided we can handle this ourselves. And sure enough, they get into this meeting. The Greek Cypriots show up with lawyers. The EU delegation is there. A big argument ensues. The Turkish Cypriots have no leg to stand on, no legal recourse. They weren't acknowledged by the Greek Cypriots at all. They were not members of the EU, and therefore they could no longer use the name halloumi for their cheese. They had to use the name halem, which is a Turkish derivative of the name. Now this may sound nonsensical to you, but I'm telling you, things like this happen in Cyprus all the time. Nonsensical things that nobody could understand. That would be absolutely asinine in some ways to others, were very real and very important to the Cypriots. Another thing that I learned early on in my time in Cyprus was it's an island. It is a slower pace than I was used to. You know, in Afghanistan, we were doing something all the time. We were moving around. You know, moving targets are harder to hit, so we were always moving. But in Cyprus, they looked at things a little bit of a different way. I'd been in the office maybe 2 or 3 days when my deputy there, Ken, asked me to have lunch with him. I said, fine, that's great. Where do you want to go? He said, no, we'll order something in. He said, I want to prove a point to you. So, okay, fine. So he calls and orders sandwiches from the little deli across the street. It was literally a catty corner across the street from our office. I thought that was odd, but okay. So he said, okay, now we wait. So what are you talking about? I said, come out on the balcony with me. So we stood out on the balcony and chatted for a little while, and in about 15 minutes, a young man comes out of the deli carrying a bag with 2 sandwiches, and he puts on a helmet. He gets on his scooter. He rides across the street to our office. He walks in, he delivers the sandwiches to our receptionist. He puts his helmet back on, he gets back on his scooter, he rides back across the street. I was absolutely, as the British would say, gobsmacked, confounded. Like, why didn't he just walk the sandwiches across the street? I mean, literally, it's across the street. But then I thought, there's something even more wrong than that. Why were we, he might have been lazy for not walking across the street instead of taking the scooter, but how lazy were we for calling in the sandwiches instead of just walking over to the deli and getting them ourselves? This was the lifestyle. Later on in our time there, Debbie and I had a very beautiful apartment there that was on the second floor of a house on the Greek Cypriot side of Nicosia. And our landlords were a very lovely couple named Demetrius and Mary. Very lovely couple. And their father had a little apartment there in their house as well. And he was just an amazing guy. But one night, we're standing in the yard talking to some people, and Mary comes out. And we said, hello, Mary, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing well. How are you? Fine. Where are you going? She said, oh, I'm going to the grocery store. And so she gets in her Mercedes, she drives down the street to the store that you could see from our house, walks in, buys a few things, 1 bag full of food, gets back in her Mercedes and drives back. Now you might say, how lazy is that? Well, you need to understand that this was a Cypriot mentality. Everybody had a car. You weren't walking. Debbie and I loved to walk from our home down to the old city of Nicosia, the walled city, on weekends. And it was very odd. The Cypriots thought it very odd because they don't walk. It's hot there in the summer. In the wintertime, the weather is much more mild, but it's just not a walking culture. And so to us, someone delivering sandwiches from across the street on a scooter, or Mary getting in her Mercedes and going down to the bodega and buying some food and then driving back is very odd, borderline just crazy. But to them, it was something that was very normal. So we began to realize the pace of this island. You know, when I left Afghanistan, I thought, okay, I've been in the belly of the beast for almost 4 years. This has been the real deal, okay? Real conflict. Going to Cyprus is going to be like a vacation. Well, I found out very quickly that that was not the case. That Cyprus was an extremely complicated place, fraught with difficulties, really overlaid with thousands of years of history that was complicated and that was messy in an area of the world that was somewhat unstable and was manipulated by two very powerful countries, Greece on one side, backed by the European Union, and Turkey on the other side. So it was, in some ways, an enigma wrapped in a riddle. Just the process of getting to work in the morning was interesting in its own right. I would get in with my Greek driver Stavros, who would drive me to the buffer zone on the Greek side. I would walk across the buffer zone. The Greek guards never even got up to say hello or check documents or anything. Simply walked across. So I would walk into what is known as the buffer zone. And in the buffer zone was this hotel that used to be a grand hotel. It was called the Ledra Palace. And it was empty then because it was caught in between the two communities. It had housed UN soldiers during the time that there was fighting going on, but the fighting had been over for years, and so this old shell of a hotel was still there. And I'd walk that buffer zone every day, and then on the other side, I would link up with my Turkish driver and get processed into what they called the Turkish Republic of Cyprus, of Northern Cyprus, but what we call the Turkish Cypriot community. And they would not stamp our passport because that would have been a violation. They stamped a piece of paper instead that we put in our passport. So just this act of living on one side and working on the other and getting to work, and in the summer walking across that buffer zone, I learned very quickly that it was so hot that you had to take an extra shirt, because if you didn't, by the time you got to work, you were literally wringing wet. Our office was not very far across the buffer zone on the Turkish Cypriot side, maybe 3 blocks. But by the time you walked that buffer zone and the 3 blocks to the office in the summertime, you were absolutely wrung out wet. And so those were the days when our dry cleaning bill was quite high, because I was wearing 2 to 3 shirts a day in the summertime in that heat. It was an odd mix of history and culture and geopolitics that created this whole situation in Cyprus. And we'll dig deeply into that in the next episode. But going from the southern part of the island to the northern part of the island, across that buffer zone in Nicosia, which the Turkish Cypriots call Lefkosia. But going across that buffer zone was a real dichotomy in that it was like going back in time. Turkish Cypriot side was in the European Union, relatively modern. What you would expect of an emerging European country. On the other side, it was almost like a time warp. It's almost like time had stood still when the separation of the island or the division of the island happened. Don't get me wrong, the Turkish Cypriot side was, in its own way, very charming and beautiful, and I would argue in some ways more interesting than the Greek Cypriot side of Lefkosia, with the mosques and the churches and the history. But it really was like stepping back 15 or 20 years in time. But Debbie and I really gained a huge appreciation for the north side of the island for several reasons. Number one, we made some very, very good friends there. We had some friends in the small village of Buyukonic in northern Cyprus, in the Turkish Cypriot community, named Lois and Ishmael Chamal. And they were absolutely amazing people. They owned a guest house there. He was kind of the de facto mayor of the town. It was just a small little village. And Ishmael looked like a pirate. The dude really truly looked like a pirate. He wore the rag around his head, had an earring, a little scruff on his face. If they built a pirate in a laboratory out of spare parts, it would have been Ishmael. But a great guy. He was a historic preservation architect, brilliant in every respect. And they owned this little guest house up there, and we used to go and stay. And our project did some things in the Buyukonic community, so we were up there a lot. And we would go out on the Karpaz. If you've seen the island of Cyprus on a map, you know it has this finger that comes out this way, and at the end of that, that finger is called the Karpaz Peninsula, and they have wild donkeys out there, and they have right at the end of the peninsula, they have a monastery that is amazing. I heard that they had renovated it since I was there. I hope they have. It was in quite a state of disrepair, but it was just an amazing monastery right at the end of this. And then they had a beach out on the Karpaz called Golden Beach because of the color of the sand. And there was literally nobody there. I mean, you would go to the beaches in northern Cyprus, nobody there. The beaches in the southern part of the island, especially in the summer, were thronged with tourists, especially British and German tourists. But in the north, you could go to a beach and you could be by yourself virtually all day long on the most beautiful beach that you can imagine, with the turquoise water of the Mediterranean surrounding it. Debbie and I have so many pictures standing alone on these beaches that were just fantastic. There was nobody there. So many strange occurrences and dichotomies on this island. There was a town of Famagusta, which I'll talk more about in another episode, that became kind of the flashpoint during the fight for the island before it was divided between the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. And there's a ghost town very close to there called Varosha. And literally the tourists had to get out of, and the residents had to get out of Varosha so fast during the war that they left everything behind. I had the opportunity to go with a delegation to this ghost town of Varosha one time and go into some of the old gutted out hotels, and there were still clothes in the closet. There were still cars covered with dust in the underground garage because people had to get out so quickly because of the war. And so now this could have been a beautiful resort, and actually had been a beautiful resort. But at that time, it was just a shell of old, empty hotels, and a reminder of the absolute angst that this island had gone through in its recent history. So we're going to dig into the island of Cyprus pretty deeply in its history, its culture, its people, its geopolitical context. And I'm going to be very frank about my assessment of my time there. I will always look back, and Debbie as well, about our time in Cyprus as a really special time. A time when we accomplished a great deal professionally, but also where we built some strong relationships that have lasted to this day. I'm very proud to say that I have great friends on the Greek Cypriot side. I have great friends on the Turkish Cypriot side. And I think that one of the reasons I was successful there is I came with the mindset from day one that I wasn't taking sides. That the situation, the political situation, was what it was. And I could not change that. But what I was going to try to do, and our team was going to try to do, is build some kind of camaraderie between the Turkish and Greek Cypriot communities that would facilitate business, that would facilitate trade, that would facilitate better relationships. And we were able to do that in very many cases. So we'll get into all of that in future episodes. I just wanted to give you an overview today of the time that I spent in Cyprus and some initial observations of this island. I would encourage you, before the next episode, take a look at the history of Cyprus. Do a Google search. Research about the Apostle Paul's time there, which we'll talk about, and many of the ancient sites in Cyprus that exist to this day. But also I would encourage you, and we'll get in deeply into what caused the conflict between the Greek and Turkish Cypriots, why the country of Greece and the country of Turkey got involved, and what that has meant not only for the island, but for Europe as a whole. So, join me for future episodes as we dig into the island of Cyprus. Until then, thanks for joining. Some stops along the way. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. A little bit shorter than usual this morning, but I just wanted to do an introduction. And you can read a lot of things that we won't even talk about in the podcast about Cyprus and other countries if you'll reach out, grab a copy of my memoirs on Amazon. I think you'll enjoy it, and it's a great companion to the podcast. All right, we'll see you next week, and looking forward to digging into the Cypriot experience.